The day started like any other for Marcus Johnson, but little did he know it would turn into a life-changing experience. Marcus was no ordinary traveler. He was a tech entrepreneur who had built his company from scratch, earning recognition in the industry. He was known for his innovative ideas and charismatic presence at conferences. Today, however, he wasn't thinking about work. All he wanted was to sit back, relax, and enjoy the comfort of first class as he flew to New York for an important business event. Marcus arrived at the airport early, dressed sharply in a tailored navy blue suit that spoke volumes about his success. His polished leather shoes clicked softly against the tiled floor as he made his way through security. With his boarding pass in hand, he headed toward the gate where his flight awaited. As he boarded the plane, he greeted the flight attendant with a warm smile before finding his assigned seat near the front of the cabin. First class was quieter than economy, filled with passengers who seemed just as eager to unwind during the journey. As Marcus settled into his plush leather seat, he pulled out his phone to check emails and review notes for his upcoming presentation. The hum of conversation around him faded into the background as he focused on his tasks. But peace didn't last long. A tall man wearing a uniform strode down the aisle, his demeanor commanding attention. This was Captain Richard Hayes, the pilot responsible for ensuring everyone reached their destination safely. Richard had been flying for over 2 decades and prided himself on his expertise. However, beneath his confident exterior lay a streak of arrogance that often rubbed people the wrong way. Richard glanced at the passengers as he moved through the cabin, mentally cataloging them. When he reached Marcus's row, something caught his eye, or rather, someone. Seeing Marcus seated comfortably in first class triggered an immediate reaction. Richard frowned slightly, his mind jumping to assumptions based on outdated stereotypes. Surely this couldn't be the right place for him. Without pausing to think, Richard stopped beside Marcus and leaned down, speaking loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Excuse me, sir," Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Are you sure you're in the correct section? This is first class." Marcus looked up calmly, meeting Richard's gaze without flinching. He held up his boarding pass, which clearly displayed his seat number and confirmed his rightful spot in the premium cabin. "Yes, I'm sure," Marcus replied evenly, his voice steady despite the insult lurking behind Richard's words. For a moment, Richard hesitated. The evidence was undeniable, yet his pride refused to let go. Instead of apologizing or moving on, he lingered awkwardly, making Marcus and several surrounding passengers uncomfortable. Some people shifted in their seats, pretending not to notice, while others exchanged subtle glances. One elderly woman sitting across the aisle raised her eyebrows disapprovingly, clearly unimpressed by the pilot's behavior. Despite the tension, Marcus chose not to escalate the situation. He knew better than to argue with someone so entrenched in their biases, especially when trapped together in a confined space thousands of feet above the ground. So he simply returned his attention to his phone, determined not to let Richard ruin his mood. Still, the sting of disrespect lingered, gnawing at him silently. Meanwhile, Richard continued his rounds, oblivious to the ripple effect of his actions. What he didn't realize was that one passenger, a sharp-eyed journalist named Claire Bennett, was watching closely. Claire had been covering stories about inequality and discrimination for years, and she immediately sensed there was more to this interaction than met the eye. Quietly, she pulled out her phone and began recording, capturing every detail of what was unfolding. Back in his seat, Marcus couldn't shake off the feeling of being judged unfairly. It wasn't the first time he'd faced such treatment, but each incident chipped away at his patience. Growing up, he'd learned to navigate a world that often underestimated him because of the color of his skin. Over time, he'd developed a thick skin, but moments like these reminded him how far society still needed to go. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Marcus stared out the window, lost in thought. Outside, the tarmac buzzed with activity as ground. Crew members scurried about. Inside, the atmosphere remained tense, though most passengers tried to focus on their own distractions. Little did anyone know this flight would soon become unforgettable, not just for Marcus but for everyone involved. And so as the engines roared to life and the aircraft lifted off the runway, The stage was set for a confrontation that would ripple far beyond the confines of the plane. For now, Marcus kept his composure, biding his time. But deep down, he knew silence wouldn't solve anything this time. Something had to change, and he was ready to be the catalyst. As the plane climbed higher into the sky, the cabin settled into a rhythm. The hum of the engines filled the air, and passengers began to relax. Some leaned back in their seats with books or headphones, while others gazed out the windows at the clouds stretching endlessly below. Marcus tried to focus on his work, scrolling through emails and jotting down notes for his upcoming presentation. But the earlier interaction with Captain Richard Hayes kept replaying in his mind like a broken record. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, Captain Hayes was in the cockpit, going through the usual pre-flight checks. Yet, instead of concentrating fully on the task at hand, his thoughts drifted back to Marcus. Richard's pride had been wounded when Marcus calmly produced his boarding pass, proving he belonged exactly where he was. For someone like Richard, who prided himself on being in control, this small act of defiance, though completely justified, felt like a personal affront. His ego simmered beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to reassert itself. About 20 minutes into the flight, Richard decided it was time to address the cabin using the intercom system. Normally, this would involve a routine update about cruising altitude, weather conditions, and estimated arrival times. Passengers expected professionalism and reassurance from their captain. But today, Richard had something else in mind. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," Richard began, his voice booming through the speakers. "This is your captain speaking. We're currently cruising at 35,000 feet and we expect smooth skies ahead." So far, so normal. Passengers glanced up briefly before returning to their activities. But then Richard paused, and the tone of his voice shifted. It became lighter, almost playful, but with an edge that made people sit up straighter. "I'd also like to take a moment to thank one of our first-class passengers for joining us today," he continued, his words dripping with sarcasm. "Mr. Marcus Johnson, wherever you are, we're thrilled to have you gracing first class with your presence. After all, it's not every day we see someone unexpected in this section." The cabin fell silent. Everyone knew exactly whom Richard was referring to. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some even chuckled nervously, unsure how to react. Was this supposed to be a joke? If so, it landed poorly. For Marcus, the words hit like a punch to the gut. He froze, his pen hovering over his notebook. His jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm. Outwardly, he showed no reaction, though inside anger and frustration bubbled just beneath the surface. He reminded himself that losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. Still, the weight of Richard's words lingered heavily in the air. Claire Bennett, sitting 2 rows behind Marcus, watched the entire scene unfold with growing disbelief. As a journalist who specialized in stories about inequality and discrimination, she recognized the insidious nature of Richard's comment. To her, it wasn't just a careless remark. It was a deliberate attempt to belittle someone based on prejudice. Claire's fingers tightened around her phone as she realized she was witnessing something significant. Without hesitation, Claire pressed record on her phone, capturing the stunned expressions of nearby passengers and the palpable tension in the cabin. She zoomed in slightly on Marcus, whose stoic demeanor spoke volumes. Though he didn't react outwardly, Claire could sense the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. This wasn't just about one man. It was about the larger issue of systemic bias and how easily it could manifest in everyday situations. As the announcement ended, the cabin remained eerily quiet. The light-hearted chatter that usually followed such updates was absent. Instead, there was an uncomfortable stillness, broken only by the faint rustle of pages turning or the occasional cough. Passengers seemed torn between pretending nothing had happened and acknowledging the awkwardness head-on. A young woman seated next to Marcus leaned over cautiously. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice tinged with concern. Marcus nodded, offering a tight smile. "I'm fine," he said softly, though his tone suggested otherwise. He appreciated her kindness but didn't want to dwell on the situation mid-flight. Instead, he focused on maintaining his composure, knowing that reacting impulsively wouldn't help matters. Richard, meanwhile, returned to the cockpit feeling smug. To him, the intercom announcement had been a clever way to put Marcus in his place, without causing too much trouble. He failed to recognize, or perhaps chose to ignore, the impact of his words. In his mind, he'd merely exercised his authority as captain, reinforcing what he believed to be the natural order of things. What he didn't realize was that his actions had already set off a chain reaction, one that would spiral far beyond his control. Back in the cabin, Claire reviewed the footage she'd captured. Her heart raced as she realized the potential significance of what she'd witnessed. This wasn't just a story about one arrogant pilot. It was a reflection of broader societal issues. She thought about the countless individuals who faced similar treatment daily, often without a platform to share their experiences. Here was an opportunity to shine a light on injustice, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. As the flight continued, the atmosphere remained tense. Some passengers avoided eye contact altogether, while others stole quick glances at Marcus, curious to see how he might respond. But Marcus stayed focused, channeling his energy into planning his next steps. He understood that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about standing up against prejudice and showing others that they didn't have to tolerate disrespect quietly. By the time the seatbelt sign blinked off, signaling the end of the turbulence-free zone, the mood aboard the plane had shifted dramatically. While most passengers resumed their activities, the underlying tension persisted. Little did anyone know, the events of this flight were about to spark a conversation that would reach far beyond the confines of the aircraft. And so, as the hours ticked by and the plane soared closer to its destination, Marcus found himself reflecting on the bigger picture. He thought about the countless stories of discrimination he'd heard throughout his life. Not just his own, but those of friends, colleagues, and strangers alike. Each one added fuel to the fire burning within, him urging him to take action. This wasn't just about teaching Richard a lesson. It was about inspiring change on a larger scale. The wheels of justice may turn slowly, but Marcus knew that sometimes all it took was one moment, one brave decision, to set them in motion. And as the plane descended toward New York City, he felt more determined than ever to make sure this moment wouldn't be forgotten. The plane touched down at JFK Airport with a gentle thud, signaling the end of the flight. Passengers stretched, gathered their belongings, and prepared to disembark. For most, it was just another routine journey, a brief pause in their busy lives. But for Marcus Johnson, this landing marked the beginning of something much bigger than he could have anticipated. As the aircraft taxied to the gate, his mind raced with thoughts about what had transpired earlier. He knew he couldn't let Richard's behavior slide, not this time. Once inside the terminal, Marcus found a quiet corner away from the bustling crowds. Pulling out his phone, he opened a social media app and began typing. His fingers moved steadily across the screen as he recounted the incident, describing how Captain Hayes had questioned his presence in first class and later mocked him over the intercom. To support his account, Marcus attached photos of his boarding pass and ticket, leaving no room for doubt about his rightful place on the flight. Before hitting post, he hesitated for a moment, considering the potential fallout. But deep down, he knew silence wasn't an option. With a deep breath, he pressed send, sharing his story with the world. What happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. Within minutes, Marcus's post gained traction. Friends and followers began commenting, expressing outrage and support. Then someone shared the post on Twitter, where it quickly caught fire. The hashtag #RespectInFirstClass started trending almost instantly, drawing attention from people around the globe. Strangers weighed in, recounting their own experiences of discrimination while traveling. Some praised Marcus for speaking up, while others demanded accountability from the airline. Meanwhile, Claire Bennett, the aviation journalist who had recorded the incident, sat in a nearby cafe reviewing her footage. She knew she had something powerful, a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the kind of prejudice that often went unnoticed or unreported. After editing the video to include captions explaining the context, she uploaded it to her professional social media accounts. Within hours, the clip went viral, amassing millions of views and sparking heated debates online. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying calls for justice and accountability. By the evening, the airline found itself at the center of a public relations nightmare. Phone lines lit up with complaints, emails flooded inboxes, and hashtags dominated social media platforms. People weren't just upset about Richard's actions. They were angry about the broader issue of systemic racism and bias in industries like aviation. The company issued a generic statement saying they were looking into the matter and committed to providing exceptional service to all passengers. But the vague response only fueled more criticism, with many accusing the airline of being tone-deaf and dismissive. For Richard Hayes, the day took a sharp turn for the worse. Initially unaware of the storm brewing online, he returned home after his shift feeling confident in his handling of the situation. He assumed Marcus would simply brush off the comments as harmless banter and move on. But when Richard finally checked his phone, he was met with a barrage of notifications, angry messages, threats, and even death wishes. Social media users had identified him as the pilot involved, posting screenshots of his employee profile alongside accusations of misconduct. His carefully constructed image as a respected professional crumbled under the weight of public scrutiny. Panicking, Richard called his supervisor, hoping for reassurance. Instead, he was summoned to an emergency meeting the following morning. Walking into the conference room, Richard felt the eyes of senior executives boring into him. Their expressions said it all. Damage control was now the top priority. The conversation that followed was tense and one-sided. Executives grilled Richard about his behavior, citing the overwhelming evidence against him, including Claire's video and first-hand accounts from passengers. Despite his attempts to defend himself, claiming he was joking and hadn't meant any harm, the writing was on the wall. That afternoon, Richard received the news he'd been dreading. The airline terminated his employment, effective immediately, citing violations of their code of conduct and policies regarding respect and professionalism. For a man who had spent decades building his career, the sudden loss was devastating. Richard left the building in shock, clutching a cardboard box containing his personal belongings. Outside, reporters swarmed him, shoving microphones in his face and shouting questions. Cameras flashed relentlessly as he pushed through the crowd, refusing to comment. It was a humiliating end to a once prestigious career. While Richard grappled with the consequences of his actions, Marcus became a symbol of resilience and dignity. Messages poured in from strangers thanking him for shining a light on an issue that had long been ignored. Influential figures, from civil rights activists to celebrities, publicly supported him, urging others to stand against discrimination. Marcus's phone buzzed non-stop with interview requests, collaboration offers, and invitations to speak at events. At first, he felt overwhelmed by the attention, but soon, he realized this was an opportunity to create meaningful change. Determined to use his platform for good, Marcus partnered with advocacy groups focused on combating racial bias in travel and other industries. Together, they drafted a petition calling for stricter regulations and mandatory diversity training for airline staff. Thousands signed within days, adding pressure on the airline to take concrete steps toward reform. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to share his story, reminding people that respect should never be conditional. As the days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of the incident spread far and wide. Schools incorporated the story into discussions about prejudice, and workplaces used it as a case study for addressing bias. Even competitors of the airline began reviewing their own practices, fearful of facing similar backlash. What had started as a single act of defiance on a routine flight had ignited a global conversation about equality and fairness. For Marcus, the experience reinforced the importance of standing up for oneself and others. Though he hadn't sought the spotlight, he embraced his role as an advocate, knowing that change often required courage and persistence. As he scrolled through the countless messages of gratitude flooding his inbox, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about holding Richard accountable. It was about inspiring others to challenge injustice wherever they encountered it. And so, as the dust began to settle, Marcus looked ahead with determination. He knew the road to true equality would be long and challenging, but he also knew that moments like these, moments of collective outrage and solidarity, were crucial steps forward. The flight may have ended, but the journey toward lasting change was just beginning. The days following the incident were a whirlwind for everyone involved, but none more so than Richard Hayes. Stripped of his prestigious position as a pilot, he found himself adrift in a world that no longer welcomed him with open arms. For someone who had spent decades commanding respect and authority, the sudden fall from grace was jarring. Richard's once polished reputation now lay in ruins, replaced by public disdain and personal shame. At first, Richard tried to rationalize what had happened. He told himself it was all a misunderstanding, a harmless joke blown out of proportion by overly sensitive people. It was just a little sarcasm, he muttered under his breath during sleepless nights. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the growing unease gnawing at him. The avalanche of criticism online, coupled with the loss of his livelihood, forced him to confront the reality of his actions. Yet instead of taking full responsibility, Richard leaned into denial, blaming stress, long hours, and even Marcus for making such a big deal out of nothing. Desperate to salvage some semblance of his former life, Richard reached out to Marcus via email. It wasn't an apology in the truest sense, it lacked sincerity and accountability, but rather an attempt to clear his conscience without admitting fault. In the message he wrote, "Dear Mr. Johnson, I wanted to extend my regrets if anything I said made you feel uncomfortable on the flight. That was never my intention. Flying can be stressful for everyone, including pilots, and sometimes jokes don't land the way we hope they will. I assure you I meant no harm." He ended the email with a plea for understanding, suggesting that Marcus might have overreacted. When Marcus received the message, he read it carefully, his expression unreadable. Though tempted to respond with anger or dismissiveness, he chose a different path. Instead, he replied briefly and diplomatically, acknowledging receipt of the email but making it clear that words alone wouldn't undo the damage. "Thank you for reaching out," Marcus wrote. "While I appreciate your willingness to communicate, I believe actions speak louder than words. This situation highlights a broader issue that requires reflection and change, not just from individuals, but from institutions as well." With that, Marcus closed the chapter on any direct interaction with Richard. To him, engaging further wouldn't serve a purpose. What mattered now was channeling his energy toward creating lasting impact. Meanwhile, the airline scrambled to address the backlash. Public relations teams worked around the clock, drafting statements and implementing measures aimed at restoring trust. They announced plans for mandatory diversity training programs for all employees, promising to foster a culture of inclusivity and respect. Additionally, they partnered with advocacy organizations to review their policies and identify areas for improvement. On paper, these steps seemed commendable, but skepticism lingered among critics who accused the company of performative activism, a superficial effort designed to quell outrage rather than drive genuine change. Despite the controversy, Marcus emerged stronger and more determined than ever. His story resonated with millions, transforming him into a symbol of resilience and dignity. People admired not only his courage in speaking up, but also his refusal to let bitterness consume him. Inspired by the overwhelming support he received, Marcus decided to take his advocacy to the next level. He began collaborating with civil rights groups, educators, and industry leaders to tackle systemic bias head-on. One of Marcus's most impactful initiatives was the creation of a mentorship program aimed at increasing representation in aviation. The idea came to him after reflecting on how rare it was to see Black pilots, flight attendants, or executives in leadership roles within the industry. If young people didn't see themselves represented in these positions, how could they aspire to them? Partnering with influential figures in the field, Marcus launched a platform connecting aspiring aviators with mentors who looked like them and understood their struggles. The program quickly gained traction, attracting participants from across the globe. Richard, on the other hand, faced a much lonelier existence. Without his pilot's license or steady income, he struggled to find work in any capacity related to aviation. Job applications went unanswered, and interviews ended abruptly when potential employers discovered his name tied to the scandal. Eventually, he resorted to taking odd jobs, driving delivery trucks, working part-time at warehouses, and even cleaning offices late at night. Each day felt like a reminder of everything he had lost, but perhaps the hardest blow came from within. Richard's relationship suffered as friends distanced themselves, unsure how to reconcile the man they knew with the one vilified in headlines. Family gatherings became awkward affairs, with relatives tiptoeing around the subject or outright confronting him about his behavior. Isolated and defeated, Richard began questioning whether redemption was possible, or if he deserved it at all. In search of answers, Richard reluctantly enrolled in therapy sessions recommended by a former colleague. At first, he resisted opening up, dismissing the process as unnecessary. But over time, he started unpacking years of ingrained biases and entitlement. Therapy forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, how his upbringing, societal conditioning, and unchecked privilege had shaped his worldview. Slowly, painfully, Richard began to understand why his actions had caused so much harm. Yet even as Richard embarked on this journey of self-reflection, forgiveness remained elusive. While he privately expressed remorse to those close to him, the public had moved on. Few cared to hear about his efforts to change. For many, the damage was done. Richard realized he would likely carry the weight of his mistakes for the rest of his life, a sobering reminder of the consequences of prejudice. Backing. In the spotlight, Marcus continued to inspire others through his work. He traveled extensively, delivering speeches at conferences, schools, and community events. One particularly memorable talk focused on turning adversity into opportunity. Standing before a packed auditorium, Marcus recounted his experience on the flight and the lessons he'd learned since. "Life has a way of testing us," he said, his voice steady and confident. "But every challenge is also an invitation to grow, to reflect, and to make a difference. When someone tries to diminish your worth, remember, you get to decide how you respond. You can let bitterness define you, or you can rise above it and use your voice to uplift others." His words struck a chord with audiences, earning standing ovations wherever he went. Through his advocacy, Marcus proved that setbacks could become stepping stones, if approached with purpose and perseverance. Weeks turned into months. The ripple effects of the incident continued to unfold. Airlines worldwide took notice, implementing stricter codes of conduct and investing in diversity initiatives. Passengers grew bolder in calling out discriminatory behavior, knowing that silence often perpetuated injustice. Conversations about race, privilege, and accountability entered mainstream discourse, challenging societies to do better. For Richard, the road ahead remained uncertain. Redemption wasn't guaranteed, nor was it easy. Yet his story served as a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how unchecked bias could derail lives and careers. And for Marcus, the journey was far from over. With each step forward, he reminded the world that true progress required not just awareness but action. Months had passed since the incident on the flight, and life had taken drastically different paths for Marcus Johnson and Richard Hayes. For Marcus, the momentum from his advocacy work only continued to grow. He became a household name, not just as a victim of prejudice but as a beacon of hope and resilience. His ability to turn a painful experience into a catalyst for change inspired countless people around the world. Meanwhile, Richard's life remained mired in regret and isolation, though he was slowly beginning to understand the gravity of his actions. Marcus's journey reached new heights when he was invited to deliver a TED Talk titled "Turning Pain into Purpose." The event took place in a grand auditorium filled with hundreds of attendees, including influential figures from various industries. As Marcus walked onto the stage, dressed impeccably in a charcoal gray suit, the audience erupted into applause. He smiled warmly, pausing for a moment to take it all in before stepping up to the microphone. "Good evening," Marcus began, his voice calm yet commanding. "Today, I want to talk about something we've all experienced at some point in our lives: pain. Whether it's personal, professional, or societal, pain has a way of shaping us. But here's the thing: pain doesn't have to define us. Instead, it can propel us toward purpose." He went on to recount the events of that fateful flight, the belittling comments, the public humiliation, and the whirlwind that followed. Rather than dwelling on bitterness, however, Marcus framed the story as an opportunity to challenge systemic biases and inspire others to speak up against injustice. He emphasized the importance of using one's platform responsibly, encouraging listeners to be allies in the fight for equality. "When someone tries to diminish your worth," Marcus said, his tone firm yet compassionate, "remember this: their opinion does not determine your value. You are enough, not because of what you achieve, but because of who you are. And when you rise above negativity, you create space for others to do the same." The audience hung on every word, many nodding in agreement or wiping away tears. By the time Marcus concluded his speech, the room erupted into a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. People rushed to congratulate him backstage, eager to share how his words had resonated with them. Among the crowd was Claire Bennett, the journalist whose video had helped bring attention to the incident. She approached Marcus with a smile, holding out her hand. "You've done incredible work," Claire said sincerely. "I'm honored to have played a small part in amplifying your message." Marcus shook her hand warmly. "Thank you, Claire. Your courage in capturing that moment made all the difference. We're stronger together." As they spoke, Claire introduced Marcus to a group of former pilots turned activists who shared his vision of creating a more inclusive aviation industry. These individuals had once held prestigious positions, but had stepped down or been forced out due to discriminatory practices within the field. Now they were determined to use their experiences to drive change. Together, they proposed an idea that excited Marcus: expanding his mentorship program to include leadership training for underrepresented groups in aviation. "We need diverse voices in decision-making roles," one of the former pilots explained. "It's not enough to increase representation among entry-level positions. We must ensure that people of color, women, and other marginalized communities have pathways to leadership." Marcus immediately embraced the concept, seeing it as a natural evolution of his existing efforts. Over the next few weeks, he worked closely with the team to develop a comprehensive curriculum focused on leadership skills, networking, and navigating systemic barriers. They named the initiative Wings of Change, symbolizing the transformative power of diversity and inclusion. Within days of its launch, applications poured in from aspiring professionals, eager to break through glass ceilings. While Marcus thrived in his newfound role as a changemaker, Richard Hayes struggled to rebuild his fractured life. Therapy sessions had opened his eyes to the depth of his biases, but understanding didn't erase the consequences of his actions. Jobs remained scarce, and social interactions grew increasingly strained. Friends and family still treated him differently, unsure how to reconcile the man they knew with the headlines that haunted him. Determined to make amends, Richard decided to volunteer at a local community center. Though it wasn't glamorous work, cleaning up after events, organizing supplies, and assisting seniors, it gave him a sense of purpose. Slowly, he began forming connections with people who cared less about his past and more about his willingness to contribute positively. One day, while helping a group of children paint murals, Richard struck up a conversation with a young boy named Jamal. Jamal reminded Richard of Marcus, not just in appearance but in demeanor. The boy exuded confidence and curiosity, asking thoughtful questions about airplanes and travel. As they chatted, Richard found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected. He talked about his love for flying and shared stories from his days as a pilot, careful to avoid any mention of the scandal. For the first time in months, Richard felt a flicker of joy, a reminder that redemption, though difficult, was possible. Back in the spotlight, Marcus continued to push boundaries. He collaborated with policymakers to draft legislation aimed at addressing discrimination in transportation industries. Airlines began adopting stricter accountability measures, ensuring that incidents like the one involving Richard would no longer go unchecked. Passengers grew bolder in speaking out against bias, knowing that their voices mattered. Conversations about privilege, representation, and allyship entered mainstream discourse, challenging societies to reflect on their values. Despite the progress, Marcus remained acutely aware of how much work lay ahead. Systemic change required patience and persistence, qualities he demonstrated daily through his advocacy. Still, he allowed himself moments of gratitude, cherishing the impact he'd made thus far. One evening, as Marcus sat in his home office, reviewing plans for Wings of Change, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. From the humiliation aboard that flight to the global movement he now led, every step had shaped him into the person he was today. He thought about Richard, too, not with anger but with a tinge of sadness. While Richard's downfall served as a cautionary tale, Marcus hoped the former pilot would find peace and redemption someday. As the sun set outside his window, casting golden hues across the room, Marcus jotted down a note to himself. Change starts with discomfort. Growth begins when we embrace it. With renewed determination, he closed his laptop and prepared for another day of fighting for justice. One flight, one conversation, and one heart at a time. The culmination of Marcus Johnson's journey came on a crisp autumn morning, months after the incident that had changed his life forever. The Wings of Change program was set to host its inaugural event, a gala celebrating diversity and inclusion in aviation. Held at a sleek convention center overlooking the city skyline, the evening promised to be a milestone not just for Marcus, but for everyone who had worked tirelessly to make the initiative a reality. Guests arrived dressed in their finest attire, buzzing with excitement as they mingled in the grand ballroom. Among them were aspiring pilots, flight attendants, engineers, and executives, all united by a shared vision of a more equitable industry. Photographers snapped pictures as Marcus greeted attendees, his warm smile lighting up the room. He moved effortlessly from one group to another, shaking hands and exchanging stories with people whose lives had been touched by his advocacy. As the lights dimmed and the crowd settled into their seats, Marcus took the stage once again. This time, however, the atmosphere felt different, more intimate, more hopeful. Behind him, a large screen displayed images of participants in the mentorship program, young men and women from diverse backgrounds donning uniforms, standing proudly beside airplanes and sharing dreams of soaring higher than ever before. "Good evening," Marcus began, his voice resonating through the hall. "Tonight, we gather not just to celebrate progress, but to honor resilience, the kind of resilience that refuses to accept the status quo. When I stepped onto that flight months ago, I never imagined it would lead me here. But sometimes life has a way of steering us toward our purpose." He paused, letting his words sink in. The audience leaned forward, hanging on every syllable. "I want to thank each of you for being part of this movement," he continued. "From the mentors who have poured their hearts into guiding the next generation, to the sponsors who believed in our mission when it was just an idea. Together, we are proving that change is possible, not just in aviation, but in every corner of society." Marcus then introduced a video montage showcasing the impact of Wings of Change. It featured testimonials from mentees describing how the program had transformed their lives. One young woman, a first-generation immigrant, spoke about overcoming self-doubt and pursuing her dream of becoming a pilot. Another participant, a Black man from a low-income neighborhood, shared how the mentorship gave him access to opportunities he'd never thought possible. Their stories painted a vivid picture of hope, determination, and triumph over adversity. When the video ended, the room erupted into applause. Tears glistened in the eyes of many attendees, including Claire Bennett, who sat near the front row. She had played an instrumental role in amplifying Marcus's message, and seeing the tangible results of their collective efforts filled her with pride. After the applause subsided, Marcus invited several program graduates to join him on stage. They stood together, representing the future of aviation. a future built on inclusivity and equality. Meanwhile, Richard Hayes watched the live stream of the event from his small apartment. Though he hadn't been invited, and likely wouldn't have attended if he had been, he couldn't help but tune in. As he listened to Marcus speak, Richard felt a mix of emotions: admiration, regret, and a lingering sadness. Watching the success of Wings of Change, he realized how far he had fallen, not just professionally but morally. While Marcus had risen above hatred and turned pain into purpose, Richard remained trapped in the aftermath of his own choices. Yet, there was a glimmer of hope within him. Volunteering at the community center had taught Richard the value of humility and service. Helping others, even in small ways, had begun to heal some of the wounds inflicted by guilt and shame. Seeing Jamal and other children look up to him reminded Richard that redemption wasn't about reclaiming what he'd lost. It was about finding meaning in what remained. Later that week, Richard decided to take another step toward healing. He wrote a letter, not to Marcus, but to the airline where he had once worked. In it, he acknowledged his mistakes and expressed gratitude for the lessons he'd learned, however painful they had been. He offered to participate in diversity training sessions, sharing his story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked bias. Whether or not the airline accepted his offer, Richard knew it was important to try, to use his experience as a tool for education rather than letting it fade into obscurity. Back at the gala, Marcus wrapped up his speech with a powerful call to action. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said, his tone steady yet impassioned. "It requires courage, persistence, and collaboration. But most importantly, it starts with us, with ordinary people choosing to stand up against injustice and fight for what's right. Let tonight remind us that no act of kindness, no word of encouragement, and no effort toward equality is ever wasted. Together we can build a world where everyone belongs." The audience rose to their feet, cheering and clapping long after Marcus left the stage. Later, during dinner, conversations buzzed with ideas for expanding the program and addressing remaining challenges in the industry. Leaders from competing airlines approached Marcus, pledging support for similar initiatives within their organizations. For the first time in years, the aviation sector seemed poised to embrace meaningful transformation. In the weeks following the gala, the ripple effects of the event spread far and wide. Media outlets covered the success of Wings of Change, highlighting its potential to inspire similar programs in other industries. Schools incorporated Marcus's story into curriculums, teaching students about resilience and the power of advocacy. Corporations began reevaluating their diversity policies, recognizing that representation mattered not just in numbers, but in influence and decision-making. For Marcus, the work was far from over. He continued traveling, speaking, and collaborating with advocates around the globe. Each new challenge fueled his determination to keep pushing boundaries and breaking barriers. Yet, amidst the whirlwind of activity, he made time to reflect on how far he'd come. What started as a single moment of humiliation had blossomed into a global movement, one that showed no signs of slowing down. Richard, too, found solace in small victories. His letter to the airline received a lukewarm response, but volunteering at the community center brought unexpected fulfillment. Over time, he formed deeper connections with the people he served, earning their trust and respect. Though he doubted he'd ever regain the prestige he once held, Richard came to understand that true worth wasn't measured by titles or accolades. It was measured by the positive impact one made on others. As winter approached, Marcus stood on the balcony of his home, gazing at the city lights twinkling below. He thought about the countless individuals who had joined him on this journey. People like Claire, the former pilots turned activists, and even Richard, whose downfall had inadvertently sparked so much change. Life had a funny way of weaving threads together, creating tapestries of meaning out of chaos and struggle. Marcus smiled softly, feeling grateful for the path he'd walked. He knew there would always be obstacles ahead, moments when progress seemed slow or setbacks inevitable. But he also knew that every challenge carried the seed of opportunity. if only one had the courage to plant it. And so, as snowflakes began to fall gently outside his window, Marcus whispered a quiet promise to himself. This is just the beginning.